Annalie looked at the black woman over the rim of the single tin cup the family owned, which had been shoved to her shortly after she entered the shack. There was no way to guess her age. The boys were obviously her children, yet there were no lines of age on her face, nor any strands of gray slipping out from beneath her immaculate head rag. She was standing next to the lone window, watching the darkness outside as if she could see better there than in the light, like a panther or a wolf. She didn't speak to Annalie for some time, and Annalie dared not try to change that condition. She was wondering if she was expected to get up and leave after drinking her water when the woman's voice sounded again, this time lower, but not quite so harsh. "What you doing out here so far from town?" Annalie set the cup down beside her pallet on the floor and thought of backing to the wall. Instead, she sat up straighter. "I'm a scout for the Newkirk militia." "Newkirk? Little as you are and by yourself? My, but they are desperate times." "Morgan is in Ohio," Annalie began, then let her words trail. Of course the woman knew Morgan was in Ohio. She was standing with a gun in her window. "Most likely south of here, though, unless he a crazy man." Annalie didn't answer. "You got a name, miss?" the woman asked. "Annalie Warner. Dr. Nathan Warner is my father." "Never heard of him, though we don't get much call for news of people around here. If you'd have said my father's the governor, I still wouldn't have known you from Eve." Annalie thought she ought to say something, but the woman didn't let her. "Mine's Davinia Portman, if you got an inclination to know it." She glanced to where Annalie sat. "Though from the looks of you, the only inclination you got is to leave this place. But don't worry, ain't nobody going to hurt you in here." Annalie glanced at the back of Davinia's head after the woman had turned back to the window. There was still no sign of her age there. The head was held as straight as a mistress's, with no bending of the slaves. Something about the rigidity of that neck made her own head hurt, so Annalie looked instead at the two boys sitting in the opposite corner. They were both slight, like their mother. The one she had thought a man in the darkness seemed little more than a boy in the light, since he favored his mother with his feminine, narrow features, high forehead, and pale, dough-brown skin. The other one, the one she now remembered had been rude to her, did not avert his eyes as the older boy was doing, even now, when she wasn't looking at him. He must have taken after his father. He was much darker and had fuller lips than either his mother or brother, giving him a perpetual pout that suited his demeanor perfectly. He stared at her as intently as his mother was staring out the window, but he was even more silent than she had been. The silence, more than his eyes, forced her to stare away from his face to the walls of the shack. From the inside she could read the print of the newspapers that had worked their way out of their crannies and now merely rested against the wood. However tattered the walls might be, though, the floor was clean, with the dirt packed down solid and the top layer of dust swept clear. The table in the middle of the room was made from 2 tree stumps with a couple of planks placed across them. It sloped a bit from one end to the other, and looked as though it would wobble from side to side if the slightest pressure were applied to it. But it held its position when the older boy leaned on it to raise himself from the floor and stand beside his mother, and the cloth-covered plate in the center of the table did not slide. "That's biscuits if you want one," Davinia said. "Sourdough, we got no milk." Annalie stood to take one. "That's all right, I like sourdough." Davinia nodded, but kept staring out the window. Annalie sat back down in her corner. She could imagine how Davinia might look the same way waiting for the boy's father at some meeting place, a creek or some such remote site. They would meet clandestinely, she sneaking from the main house with the pretense of emptying her mistress's chamber pot, and he slipping from the smithy with the excuse of drawing more water for the forge. Annalie might have surprised herself had she guessed how nearly right she was. Davinia moved slightly at the window. "Well, I reckon not tonight." She handed the gun to her mute for him to place on 2 pegs above the door, then picked up a biscuit from the plate on the table. "You want another one?" Annalie shook her head, even though the little bite that she had left of her first biscuit would certainly not satisfy her. She took a drink of water instead. "You just lie back there, then, and rest," Davinia said as she took a bite of her own biscuit. "Ain't no needin' you riding out again tonight." I really should go on at least to this town you mentioned. How far is it?
A good 6 miles. But you don't want to ride in the night. Rough between here and there.
I think I can manage.
You think wrong.
Annalie just looked at her a moment, until a crack outside made them both jump. The older boy reached for the gun and threw it to his mother in the same moment she yelled out, "Who there?" "Mackie," came the breathless reply, and seconds later a grizzled and shirtless white man tossed back the quilt door with one hand and dragged a black man on his other shoulder. Dear Lord! Annalie and Davinia breathed simultaneously when they saw the reason this man was being dragged. His left pant leg was torn from the hip to the ankle, but instead of flapping open when they moved, the 2 strips of cloth stuck to his calf as if melded to it. "It's real bad," Mackie said, as Davinia removed the biscuit plate from the table and situated it instead on a shelf built into the wall. The man's leg would hang off the end of the table if he were to lie down straight, so the 2 boys pulled it to a wall to serve as back support before Mackie set the man down. "I didn't have nothing but my shirt to tie his leg off, and I reckon it's too bulky to do much good." Davinia unwound her head rag and tied it above the place where Mackie's shirt was soaked through. Annalie stood staring at her in her corner. Davinia's hair was solid gray. "Where he hurt?" Davinia asked as she looked over the leg. "I couldn't see rightly where it went in, but you sure can tell where it came out." Davinia turned to Annalie. "Come here." Annalie didn't move. "I said come here. Your daddy a doctor, right? You know anything about it?" Annalie shook her head, but she obeyed Davinia in coming over. "Hold that light over here," she ordered as she exposed the exit wound. "Hold it still, I say. Lord, Lord." Annalie watched as Davinia jammed a finger into the wound and withdrew it immediately as the man writhed. "Hold him. Rob, run get the doctor. Take that horse out there. We got to have something for the pain whether he'll come or not." "I get him, but he ain't coming," the younger boy said as he flipped the quilt out of his way. It ripped from its nails and dropped to the ground. "Hold him tight." Mackie and the mute leaned over his body. Davinia motioned for Annalie to hand her the belt from her dress and doubled it over to put it on the man's mouth. "Here, bite down on that till your teeth go back up in your head." He was only slightly less violent in his reaction the second time Davinia probed the wound, but she did not back away again for several moments. "Ah, there it is now. Lord, they done killed this man." Davinia looked up to Annalie. "You see right there?" The blood flow had stopped just enough to allow a still pool to form beneath Davinia's hand instead of pouring over the edges of the hole in the man's thigh. Fragments of bone floated in it like driftwood, and the 2 shattered ends of the thigh bone stood out of the pool like roots standing out of a dried-up swamp. Davinia held 2 ends of a severed blood vessel. It was just like the vessels Annalie pulled out of her meat when she ate pot roast. "Hold the 2 ends. They try to slip away from you, but don't let 'em. I gotta have needle and thread." Annalie's voice sounded small. "My hands are dirty." "Go get your fingers in there." Tuesday, 14 October, 1862. I've gotten used to most of the women nurses here, though I can't say I like 'em all. Mrs. Tanner is quite possibly the most annoying creature on earth. She has absolutely no compunction about modesty. The fellow next to me told me that in those first days we were here, when I was insensible, the regular nurses were trying to delouse some of the soldiers, and she came in bold as day, demanding to know what one of the male nurses had done with the food requisition for our ward. The men were scrambling to hide their nakedness, but she told them she had 5 sons, so nobody had anything she hadn't seen before. She tried to give me a sponge bath the other day, but I threw a fit and scared her off. I admire pluck in a woman, but she's got a little more than I care to see. It's a wonder the staff doesn't send her packing. She gives women nurses a bad name. There are 6 other women nurses here regularly, but I'm told several other women come in from the city occasionally to help. Miss Penning directs them, and she's a regular general. She knows something of military efficiency, as each nurse has specific duties which are performed meticulously. She works them in shifts, but her woman's heart allows them to stay past time to keep some of us company. I like her. She confided to me that she can barely stand Mrs. Tanner herself,
but is forced to endure because of the lack of volunteers willing to work regularly at the hospital. I like the other nurse of our ward, Miss Mary as she's called, about as well as Miss Penny. She's ever so kind about bringing me my morphine ration whenever I call for it, Mrs. Tanner having refused my request only moments before. The only strike against her is she sits by me at meal times and forces me to eat a bit by threatening to cry. At least she's not as bad as that Bible-toting Mrs. Flynn from the Christian Commission, who's coming down the ward now, smiling at me as she's caught me awake and writing. I can't shut my eyes now, but must endure Moses and his bunch until I really do fall asleep.